Welcome to the third module of the Environment Agency's BIM e-learning. In this module, we'll look at mobilisation, tender and award. In the last module, we looked at what the EA needs to do to prepare a tender in accordance with BIM. We learned about British standards and industry-wide protocols, which set out the common language of BIM terms and processes. We saw that the Employer's Information Requirements is a specification published by the Environment Agency as a client to describe our minimum technical requirements for BIM. And we learned how to start a project with BIM by incorporating our information requirements into a tender pack to be issued to suppliers. In this module, we'll look at what happens next. We'll see what the suppliers need to provide in their tender response to comply with BIM rules, how to evaluate the BIM components of their response, and what needs to be done after tender award to get the project going in a BIM-compliant manner. To start with, we'll take a look at BIM Execution Plans, or BEPs, which are issued by the supplier at certain times in the tender process. You'll learn about the different types of BEP that apply to a project, the volume and location strategy, and how to evaluate these once you receive them from a supplier. Then, you'll learn about BIM-compliant tender responses. You'll learn what components BIM adds to a tender response, and how to evaluate these components. After that, we'll look at the post-award activities and what you need to do to prepare the information delivery plan and the common data environment to deliver the work once you're ready to award the contract. In the first part of this module, we'll take a look at BIM Execution Plans. In Module 2, we saw that the Employer's Information Requirements sets out the EA's minimal technical requirements for managing data and information in projects. That document sets out roles and responsibilities for the EA and the supplier, and explains technical requirements around modelling, information transfer, file formats, and so on. The supplier's BIM Execution Plan is a response to the EIR, so it explains how the supplier will meet the requirements we've set out as the client. The two documents work together to define how BIM will be implemented in a project. In the BEP, you can expect to see several important topics covered. The BEP provides detail on the supplier's common data environment. The supplier confirms which platform they propose to use that is compliant with PAS 1192, and that they will use the employer's common data environment to exchange information and data with us. It acknowledges the use of the Information Delivery Plan to manage data and information, and depending on the type of BEP will make reference to the supplier's marked up IDP or master IDP. Explains how the supplier will collaborate through BIM, for example, how to manage model coordination between different disciplines and methods of collaborating with project stakeholders. The BEP names the people who will carry out key roles and responsibilities, for example, the Supplier Information Manager, and gives evidence of their competency to carry out the role. It confirms technical aspects, such as file formats to use, coordinate systems, the software they'll use, and so on. It should also give an assessment of the current level of BIM-relevant training for the staff who will deliver the project, and present a training plan for any staff who will need additional training. The BEP explains how BIM will be used to improve the way health and safety risks and hazards are managed throughout the project. And finally, if the supplier is planning to engage any sub-suppliers, it includes an assessment of their supply chain's capability to deliver BIM. There are different types of BEP produced at different stages of the tender process, and each type of BEP will cover these topics in varying degrees of detail. The first type of BEP we'll look at is the one which sets the scene for the two other types of BEP. This is the Framework BEP. Each supplier has produced a BEP which applies to all the work they bid for through a specific framework. The Framework BEP contains details of standard methods and practice, so it's not project-specific. Because of this, Framework BEPs are evaluated by the EA's National BIM team, so you don't need to evaluate the Framework BEP for any suppliers who bid for your work. The focus of the Framework BEP is to establish the technical standards that the supplier will adhere to when they deliver work for the Environment Agency. It covers topics such as the software packages that the supplier will use to deliver the work, such as the CAD and modelling software they'll use, the native file formats of the work they'll deliver, an outline of the methodology they'll use to manage their models. For example, their approach to clash detection and discipline management. The standard procedures they'll follow to manage data and information, to comply with PAS 1192, and our employees' information requirements. This should include details of their own common data environment, details about how they train their staff about BIM, and other technical matters. The next two types of BEP are both produced during the tender and award of a piece of work. The first of these is the pre-award BEP, or pre-BEP for short. This document is project-specific and is received from the supplier as part of their tender response. The aim of the pre-BEP is to give us confidence that the supplier understands the data and information requirements for the project, and that they're capable of achieving these requirements. Therefore, it contains information about how the supplier will implement the project. The pre-BEP contains the details of the person the supplier is putting forward to undertake the supplier information manager role. It also explains how the supplier will use BIM on the project to improve health and safety by finding hazards and communicating them to those involved in building, operating and maintaining the asset. If your project needs to handle sensitive information, the pre-BEP will explain the supplier's security protocol for managing this. And the pre-BEP will contain the supplier's marked up IDP. If the supplier proposes doing something on the project which changes what they've stated in their framework BEP, then the pre-BEP should also include some information about that. The final type of BIM execution plan is the post-award BEP. Again, this is project-specific, but this time is produced once the contract has been awarded. Under the terms of the EIR, the supplier must produce the post-BEP within 6 weeks of contract award. The post-BEP builds on the pre-BEP issued in the tender pack. It confirms the details of the proposal made in the supplier's tender and adds more information on how the supplier will implement BIM on the project. The post-BEP needs to confirm who will be carrying out roles to manage information for the supplier. At a minimum, this will include the supplier information manager, but should also contain details of the lead designer and key task team managers, as well as the information manager for any sub-supplier they may have appointed. It also needs to include details of any training required to teach the supplier's team about BIM. This should include a programme of who needs the training, the courses they'll attend, and planned date of the training, to give us confidence that any training that's required will be delivered promptly. If the supplier intends to appoint sub-suppliers, the post-BEP needs to include an assessment of their capability to deliver BIM, as well as details of any required training. And the post-BEP needs to contain the volume and location strategy for the project, along with the master information delivery plan. As with the pre-BEP, if the supplier has proposed anything which changes their framework BEP in order to deliver their work for the project, then the post-BEP needs to contain some more information about what those changes are. When projects have been packaged, we can deal with BEPs slightly differently in order to work more efficiently. With a package, the pre-BEP can be produced to cover all the projects in a package. There's no need to produce one for each project. Post-BEPs can usually be dealt with in the same way, with one for the whole package. However, there can be circumstances where one project needs to be managed in a different way to the others. For example, different personnel working on it, a need for high security or more complex project requirements. In this case, you'll still need a specific post-BEP for this project. In all cases, every project needs to have its own IDP and MIDP, and its own volume and location strategy. Now, we'll have a closer look at the BIM elements you'll receive in a tender response, and how to evaluate them when you're scoring the bid. As we saw in Module 2, in terms of BIM, there are 2 key items you'll receive from the supplier in their tender response. The first of these is the pre-BEP that we've just discussed, which is supported by the supplier's framework BEP. The second is the marked up information delivery plan. These 2 items will be part of any supplier's response to work we scope for them, whether it's part of a competitive tender or an appointment to a single supplier through an arrangement such as a program delivery unit or the collaborative delivery framework. Let's start by looking at the purpose of the marked up IDP and how to evaluate it. When the supplier receives the IDP from us in the tender pack, there's two things for them to look at. Firstly, the IDP will contain a list of all the information that's already been created by the project and added to the common data environment. This enables the supplier to see the information that they'll need to use as a basis for their own work, and evaluate whether there are any gaps that they'll need to fill. Secondly, the IDP shows exactly what's included in the tender and information that the EA expects the supplier to deliver as part of the contract. The purpose of the marked up IDP is to give the supplier a chance to comment on the IDP. It's the start of the collaborative process of delivering the project with a supplier. As an intelligent client, we generally have a good idea of what information we'll need in order to satisfy the project gateway requirements and plain language questions. But the supplier can also use their knowledge and experience to help us ensure we collect all the information we need. For example, a designer can propose adding to the profile deliverables if they know that a certain design process will produce extra information that we haven't identified. Or a contractor might realise that the IDP is missing some of the health and safety documentation they'll produce to manage the site. This can also work the opposite way. The supplier can suggest removing or de-scoping deliverables if they think they won't add much value. For example, if the same information will be produced as part of a different deliverable, this can reduce the cost of delivering the work and help the team to work more efficiently. To help the supplier in evaluating and marking up IDPs, when you create your IDP, it's always good to give the supplier as much detail as possible about why you're asking for certain things. A good way to do this is to use the delivery note function on the IDP, where you can provide detail on the purpose of the deliverable. The marked up IDP is a proposal made to the EA project team. We can choose to accept or reject the changes that the supplier suggests, and this is part of the process you need to follow when you award the contract. We'll talk more about this later in the module. Now we'll look at an example IDP and add some markup to show what you can expect to receive from the supply chain. Here is a sample IDP, looking at the design deliverables. We can see from the stages at the top that detailed design is the pending stage, which means that we're tendering for work at the detailed design stage. The suppliers mark up an IDP by adding comments and annotations. Here are some of the things they could mark up. They could identify additional deliverables to add to the IDP. This could be because they know they'll need to produce the deliverable as part of their work, or something they identify that could be useful to the EA in the project. When marking up the IDP, the supplier should explain why they've added the deliverable. On the other hand, they can also identify deliverables to be removed, again providing an explanation of why it's appropriate to remove the deliverable. The supplier could suggest changes to the level of definition if they identify that a higher or lower LOD could be suitable. They could ask questions about the existing information profiled in the IDP. And they could suggest changes to the open formats nominated for each deliverable, or identify where native formats will be provided. This isn't an exhaustive list. The supplier can mark up all of the IDP, so there's lots they could comment on. From this, you can see that the idea of the marked up IDP is to refine the one issued by the EA, and to benefit from the supplier's knowledge of how they'll deliver their work in order to build a plan that captures all the right information. The other item you'll receive from the supplier is the pre-award BIM Execution Plan, which we introduced earlier in this module. You'll remember that the key elements of the pre-BEP are roles and responsibilities, health and safety, security, and the marked up IDP. We've also added another icon here to show you that you need to consider how the framework BEP applies to the project. We've just looked at evaluating the marked up IDP, so let's take a look at how to evaluate the other parts of the pre-BEP. The first element you need to look for is roles and responsibilities. In the pre-BEP, the only role that needs to be named is the Supplier Information Manager, with evidence of their capability to carry out their role. In particular, the ability to manage a CDE in accordance with PAS 1192. The pre-BEP should also show an overview of the relevant training that the person has received about BIM, and particularly any training they've received which relates to carrying out the Supplier Information Manager role. For health and safety, we want to know how the supplier will use BIM to improve the way they will manage hazards and risks. In particular, BIM offers really good opportunities to improve the way hazards are initially identified, then communicated and presented to the people working on the project. The exact techniques that might apply to your project will depend on what it is you're delivering. But you can look for things like the use of 4D BIM to simulate the construction, operation and maintenance processes to identify and mitigate risks, tagging hazards in federated models, and the use of visualizations and walkthroughs to help identify risks before they occur. Remember that BIM is about the whole asset lifecycle, so a good pre-BEP will also consider how BIM can help reduce risks during operation and maintenance of the built asset. If your project contains elements which have an elevated security classification, in other words, higher than the official status that covers the majority of our work, then the pre-BEP needs to explain how these sensitive documents will be managed. To do this, the supplier needs to include an outline project security management plan, which explains the procedures and systems that will be used to ensure the security of data and information. If the project doesn't require elevated security, then the pre-BEP should confirm that standard corporate security procedures, as outlined in the Framework BEP, will be followed. Finally, the pre-BEP should confirm whether the standard procedure outlined in the Framework BEP will be followed. This covers details such as the way data and models will be managed, software to be used, and standard training to be rolled out to project staff. If there are any details which deviate from the Framework BEP, then the pre-BEP should highlight these and provide an overview of what will be done differently. We've now covered the key points about evaluating a BIM-compliant tender return. We've seen a marked-up IDP and discussed its role in the tender response, and we've looked at how to evaluate a pre-BEP. Before you can award the contract to the supplier, there's one more step you need to complete. This is to agree the final IDP with the supplier, based on their feedback in the marked-up IDP. The purpose of updating the IDP is to incorporate any changes made as a result of the supplier's markup. For this reason, agreeing the final IDP should be done collaboratively with the supplier. We don't need to accept everything the supplier has changed. The IDP is part of the scope of works, so it's the EA's choice as to what is included. When we do accept changes, it's important that the Employer Information Manager, usually the project manager, updates the IDP to reflect them, so that when the contract starts, both parties have clear sight of what needs to be produced and can use the IDP to manage the information. Here you can see the arrows showing where our example IDP has been updated based on the supplier's markup. Finally, the EA Employer Information Manager needs to update the supplier role code in the IDP away from the generic code used at tender to the specific code for the supplier delivering the work. You can find information about this in the CDE and IDP user guide, which is linked in the course notes. Now we've learned about evaluating and awarding a BIM-compliant contract, we'll look at the activities you need to carry out once the contract has been awarded. As we've seen previously, after contract award, the supplier needs to provide 2 items within 6 weeks of the contract start date. They both build on the BIM documentation that was issued as part of the tender response. They are the Master Information Delivery Plan and the Postaward BIM Execution Plan. The post-BEP also needs to include the supplier's volume and location strategy. Let's start by looking at that. In Module 1, we showed that location codes are used to describe where something is, and that volumes describe what type of thing it is. The purpose of the volume and location strategy, then, is to define the codes that the supplier will use in delivering their work. How they decide to define volumes and locations is up to the supplier, as it needs to fit in with how they'll deliver the work. For example, how they'll structure their models. There are EA-defined standards that need to be adhered to, though. These are defined in the Employee's Information Requirements, So when you're reviewing a volume and location strategy, it's always a good idea to refer to the latest version of the EIR to check it complies with the rules. Once a code has been defined, it'll stay live for the duration of the project. If a supplier wishes to use volume or location codes defined by another supplier in a previous stage, then that's fine. The next item the supplier needs to prepare is the Master Information Delivery Plan, or MIDP. This builds on the comments the supplier made in their marked up IDP, and the final IDP that was agreed prior to the contract being awarded. The purpose of the MIDP is to create a plan of the data and information that the supplier will deliver. To that end, the supplier needs to populate each deliverable with the files they'll issue to fulfill the requirement. In other words, for each deliverable assigned to the supplier, they need to add one or more items defining the file they'll deliver. Each item needs to be populated with the correct metadata, including volume and location codes, which will define the BS 1192 compliant file name and enable us to search for specific files in the common data environment. For this reason, it's important that the supplier adds their agreed volume and location strategy to the MIDP, so they can use their volume and location codes as metadata. The items also need to be profiled to the specific stage when they'll be delivered, as indicated by where the deliverable has been profiled. Every deliverable needs to have at least one item added to it. The MIDP is a living document. It's designed to be used throughout project delivery to keep track of all the information that a project produces. It needs to be reviewed and updated regularly by the supplier and employer information managers to make sure that it's always populated with the information and data that has been or will be delivered. If used in this way, the IDP will allow you to see at a glance what information has been delivered and what deliverables are still yet to be produced. Finally, within the 6-week period after contract award, the supplier also has to produce the Postaward BIM Execution Plan, or Post-BEP. This builds on the pre-BEP to provide more detail on how the supplier will deliver the project with BIM. As we've already discussed, the Post-BEP needs to include the volume and location strategy and the MIDP. It should cover some key elements, including roles and responsibilities, training requirements, supply chain capability, health and safety, and security. It also needs to refer to the framework BEP and confirm that the procedures set out in that are being followed. The Post-BEP is an implementation document. It needs to contain firm details about how exactly the supplier will implement BIM when delivering their work. We've already looked at the volume and location strategy and the MIDP, so let's have a look at the rest. As before, the key role that needs to be identified in the Post-BEP is the Supplier Information Manager. Generally, this should be the same person as proposed in the pre-BEP, but if not, then there should also be evidence of the new person's capability to carry out the role. The Post-BEP also needs to identify the lead designer and any task team managers, and any other key personnel who will be involved in delivering the work. The Post-BEP should contain a clear plan on the BIM training needs for staff who will deliver the work. To start with, it needs to include a brief assessment of the level of BIM capability for the key supplier staff who will be involved in information management. If any staff need further training, then the BEP will also show the training plan for those staff. This needs to be a concrete programme. Who requires training, what courses they'll attend, and when. This is to provide the EA project team with the confidence that any training needs will be addressed in a timely fashion, and to flag it as a project risk if the programme isn't kept. If the supplier intends to appoint sub-suppliers, then the capability of their key staff needs to be assessed in exactly the same way, and a training plan put in place if needed. The health and safety section of the Post-BEP should add more detail to what was proposed in the pre-BEP. The supplier should explain what measures they've already put in place to aid in managing health and safety on the project, as well as detail on what they plan to do whilst delivering the work. Remember that this should include hazards throughout the life cycle of the asset, in other words, including operational and maintenance activities, and not just the construction phase. As with the pre-BEP, if the project will handle any information or data which has a government classification higher than official, then the supplier needs to include their project's security management plan. At the post-BEP stage, this should be sufficiently developed to show that the supplier is able to manage any sensitive data and information. Finally, as with the pre-BEP, the post-BEP needs to confirm that the standard procedures outlined in the framework BEP will be followed. This includes information about model management methodologies, software to be used, including the supplier CDE, and other standard procedures for implementing BIM. If there's any deviation from the framework BEP, then this needs to be thoroughly explained so that we can have confidence that the supplier's proposed way of working doesn't cause problems for us receiving data and information. This completes Module 3 of the Environment Agency BIM e-learning. This module explained the activities that need to be completed to evaluate BIM-compliant bids from suppliers, and to prepare the project to deliver work. You've learned about the different types of BIM execution plans, framework BEPs, which explain at a general level how a supplier will deliver work for the EA, pre-award BEPs, which are project-specific proposals which detail how BIM will be implemented, and the post-award BEP, which is the project-specific plan that details exactly how BIM will help the supplier to deliver their work. You saw how the volume and location strategy provides the supplier's definition of the volume and location codes they'll use, and you've learned how to evaluate all these components. Then you saw the different components you'll receive from a supplier in response to a tender. This is the pre-BEP and marked up IDP, and you've learned what to look for when evaluating these. You've also learned how to evaluate the post-award developments of these components, the post-BEP, and the master IDP. Finally, you learned how to prepare the information delivery plan and common data environment so that they're ready for work to be delivered once the contract is awarded. In particular, the necessity to update the IDP before awarding the contract so that it reflects what's been agreed with the supplier from the marked up IDP. There will now be a short test on what you've learned in this module. To pass, you need to score at least 70% overall. Good luck!